So we're all good to go. Hi everyone, thanks for joining in. I'm really excited to have Chris Hammer joining us today. So Chris Hammer, for those who don't know, was a journalist for more than 30 years, dividing his career between covering Australian federal politics and international affairs. For many years, he was a roving foreign correspondent for SBS TV's flagship current affairs program Dateline, and he reported from more than 30 countries on 6 continents. Scrublands was his first novel, which was published in 2018 and shortlisted for Best Debut Fiction at the Indie Book Awards, shortlisted for Best General Fiction at the Australian Book Industry Awards, and shortlisted for the UTS Glenda Adams Award for New Writing at the New South Wales Premier Literature Awards, and won. Sorry, I just lost my place there for a minute. It flicked out of where I was looking. And won the UK Writers Association John Creasley Debut Dagger Award. Silver was published in 2019 and was shortlisted for Best General Fiction at the Indie Book Awards and shortlisted for Best Industry Awards. And for some reason, Facebook keeps flicking back and forth and really mucking up what I'm reading. I'm so sorry about that. I don't know what it's doing. And his latest book is Treasure and Dirt, which I've got a copy here. Wanted to just say, Chris, I'm a bit bad. I've never read any of your books before until I read Treasure and Dirt, and really, really enjoyed Treasure and Dirt. So I will be looking out for more of your books and making sure I read more. And just wanted to mention to everyone watching that thanks to Ellen and Unwin, if you ask a question during the Facebook Live, you'll have a chance to win a copy of Treasure and Dirt. So thanks so much, Chris, for joining us. Just wondering if you want to start off by telling us a little bit about Treasure and Dirt.
Yeah. Okay. So it's a crime fiction book, and it's a standalone book, so you don't have to have read any of the previous 3. If you've enjoyed the previous 3, which is Scrublands, Silver, and Trust, I suspect you might enjoy this one. The book starts, and this isn't a spoiler because it's there in the prologue in the first couple of pages. We're with a crew of ratters. Now, ratters, as I found out, are the lowest of the low. They are opal thieves. They go down to their colleagues' mines in the dead of night. They get a word that someone's on a good run. They found a good patch of opals, and they plunder their gems and then disappear off into the night. So we're with a team of ratters in this very remote outback town called Finnegan's Gap. They've gone down a mine in the middle of the night, and instead of opals, they discover a body, a miner who's been murdered. And not just murdered, he's been crucified and his body left there to rot down the mine. So these ratters, they just hightail it out of there. They don't want to have anything to do with this. But at least they've got enough conscience to ring up the police, to leave an anonymous tip with Crime Stoppers. And that's how the book starts. The narrative proper begins with the arrival in town of two detectives. One's a homicide detective, Detective Sergeant Ivan Lukic from Sydney. He's meant to be there with his boss, but he can't make it. So he's teamed up with a very inexperienced young detective, Detective Constable Nell Buchanan, who comes from way out in the west of the state in Burke. They arrive at this town called Finnegan's Gap, which is a wide open, it's a wild town. There are all these eccentric opal miners, some living rough and ready in a squatter's camp called Deadman's Wells. There's a mad religious cult there called the Rapture that also mines opals and is disliked intensely by the other miners because it kind of recruits young adherents to the cult and then puts them to work mining opals. And there's a couple of these big, larger-than-life billionaire miners who are running big industrial mines. To completely, well, starts off as a completely separate storyline. And the other thing that our two protagonists, Ivan and Nell, soon find themselves confronting are their own trials and tribulations, their own pasts catching up with them, to the point where for them each individually, their careers are on the line. And so their relationship is part of the book too, whether or not they trust each other, whether or not they support each other. So that, if you like, that's kind of the elevator pitch. That's where it starts from at any rate.
Yeah, and I found ratters was a really interesting description. I'd never heard of that before. Had you heard about that before?
No. So what happened last year, as you know, just before Trust was coming out, I started thinking about my next book. And I had this idea for a crime story set in a big mine, like one of those big iron ore mines or coal mines way out in the middle of nowhere, in a fly-in, fly-out workers camp, because I thought that would be a really good atmosphere for a murder, right? For a crime. And I was thinking of driving over to South Australia to go to the Flinders Ranges, because I know there are some big mines up in the South Australian desert. And I'd never been there, and I thought, what a dramatic landscape. But then COVID hit and all the internal borders in Australia shut down. And I live in Canberra, so the one place I could get to was New South Wales. For overseas listeners, that's the state that sort of surrounds where I live. I live in Canberra. It's a bit like Washington, DC. It's got its own little territory, but then it's surrounded by a much larger state. And I was thinking of heading way out west. There's a very famous mining town out there called Broken Hill. But then I was just down at the local shops, and I just happened to glance, a woman walked past, and she was wearing an opal pendant. And I thought, an opal mine, an opal mining town. Because here in Australia, they're notorious for being quite sort of wild and having a lot of wild characters, because opals are mined by individuals or partnerships. They're very small. They're not big industrial mines. So I thought I could have that, and then I can still, you know, place a few big kind of global scale mines nearby for the billionaire type story. And so I drove up to Lightning Ridge, which is a famous Australian opal mining town, still in New South Wales, but way up north, right near the Queensland border. And the first day I was there, I walked into the miners' co-op to get some help, which I was successful in doing. Some very generous miners took me down their mines, showed me the ropes and that. But I walked into this office, and the first thing I saw on the wall was this big sign saying "Gob in a ratter."
Oh, really?
And I said, and I went, "What's a ratter?" And they explained it to me, and I went, "Oh, I can use that."
Yeah. I'm just going to, so Karina was meant to be joining us, everyone watching, and I'm just going to try and add her. She had a bit of a technical difficulty. Karina, I don't know if you can hear us, Karina, but we're live in the group now.
Yeah, hi everyone. Sorry, you know what? Zoom decided it was going to update.
Oh, okay.
Hi, Chris. Good to see you.
Hi, Karina. I've just given the elevator pitch for
heard.
the story.
I could hear you.
Oh,
that's good.
And I've just finished reading it as well. Actually, you know what? I listened to it on audio.
Oh, good.
Yeah, it was really, really good. The voice was fantastic. I don't know if you've had a chance yet to listen to it, Chris, but it's really great voice.
No, the one who does the Australian audio books, George Swallow, he did the previous 3 books, Scrublands, Silver and Trust, and I just know how good he is. What amazes me with the audio books is that when they're reading a descriptive passage, because that's pretty straightforward, it's when they're doing the dialogue and bouncing from like a male voice to a female voice and whatever. It's wow, what skill.
Yeah, it's acting, isn't it? I can remember I had to audition a voice for my novel, and they were all actors, like professional actors. That's their job, you know.
Yeah.
But I was going to say that we're, you know, 2 Exjournals. You know, what is it about Exjournals? Do we have to reinvent ourselves as authors? Is that what we're doing? I mean, there's so many of us now.
Well, I think part of that is so many journos have lost their jobs in the last few decades. But
True.
it is true of in Australian crime fiction in particular. Michael Robotham, former journo, Jane Harper, former journo, me, Michael Brissenden, former journo, Tim Ailiff, still a journo, yourself. The curious thing though, a lot of us, my first 3 books had a journalist as a protagonist. A lot of people, former journalists, haven't done that. So it's interesting. This book, for those who've read the previous 3 books, is interesting because I decided that I needed to give Martin Scarsden and Mandalay Blonde Mandy a break, because in all those first 3 books, they're not just sort of hands-off, disinterested investigators. They've really got their skin in the game, a kind of a lot at stake, if you like. And I kind of couldn't really work out a storyline that would involve them in the same way. And then, so I thought, I'll try some new characters. But I thought, well, it's not much point just having another journalist, because it'll just come across as kind of like Martin Scarsden light. And as the story evolved, very quickly I made the decision that this time I'd go with some police officers. So that was a bit of a step into the unknown for me.
And I've got quite a few questions coming through, so I might start asking some of the questions from people. MJ said that she also noticed that Treasure and Dirt has an alternative title, Opal Country. Is that in different countries it's called Opal Country?
Yeah, so I've got different publishers in different places, right? So this is the UK edition. This is actually what's called an advanced reading copy. So it's not published in the UK until January in book form, but it's already published as an ebook. It's a curious thing. I think it's so people in Britain and Europe and whatever just don't go and buy the Australian ebook. Anyway, so Opal Country you can get as an ebook at the moment. And probably in the US too, I'm not so sure there. And then the hardback will come out in January and a paperback later in the year. So it's Treasure and Dirt in Australia, New Zealand, Opal Country pretty much everywhere else. And in translation, who knows?
It's interesting that they do that, though. It sometimes makes it a little bit confusing, I have to say, as a reader. But
yeah, I mean, it's the first time it's happened with me. So the other 3 books are all in the same title. But opals are actually associated very closely with Australia for many foreigners, for tourists. You come here and, at the airport, the duty-free shops are full of opals and whatever. So it is associated with us more than we probably know ourselves living here. So it kind of makes sense, I think.
Yeah. And you did mention before that you went to Lightning Ridge, I think it was. Is that right? Lightning Ridge?
Yeah.
So Kim's wondering if you did much travel to any other outback towns for research.
Well, before Scrublands is set in western New South Wales, the Hay Plain, which is a very flat, incredibly flat landscape. It's like a billiard ball. And Silver is set on the north coast of New South Wales. And both are set in fictional towns, just like Treasure and Dirt are set in a fictional town. But all 3 of those places are real landscapes. And the first 2 come from, during my time as a journalist, I used to, on occasion, travel into the bush and just as an individual. But I wrote 2 non-fiction books, and one was called The River, and I travelled at the height of the millennial drought, so the summer of about 2008, 2009, all the way through the Murray-Darling Basin, from the headwaters up in Queensland all the way to the lower lakes. And I spent a week in a town not dissimilar to the town Riversend in Scrublands. And then I wrote a kind of companion book travelling down the east coast of Australia,
Mm.
and so I had the landscapes. One reason I don't use real towns though. My third book is set in Sydney, and I wasn't going to try and invent a fictitious city of 4 or 5 million people somewhere on the east coast of Australia. That would have been ridiculous.
Sydney's not real anyway, Chris, you know.
I know, but there's a couple of reasons. And one is I can shape the town to fit the storyline. So in Silver, there's an area, there's a beach that's over some hills, so there's no mobile phone reception. In Treasure and Dirt, there's the town in a hollow, and there's 2 ridges, and where the opals are mined, and there's a dry lake bed, and it all falls in and helps the plot. And I'll just show you this book, like all the other books.
Are we going to talk maps?
It's got this great map.
Yeah, I like the map.
Sort of drawn, well, sketched out roughly by me, but then done by a real artist, Alexander Potocznik. The other thing too, as Karina would know, is for these small towns, having fictional towns is much easier legally, because if you set it in a real town and you had it full of corruption and criminality and all that, you'd probably end up with a defamation risk the way this country is. So that's another advantage to having a fictional town.
You know what I really love about your books, Chris, is that they have so many different plots running through them. There's a main plot and there's like 3 or 4 other little plots going on the whole time. So does that mean that you're this big planning writer, or are you a pantser maybe?
I'm actually more of a pantser. So for the listeners who are not sure what we're going on about, crime writers are often split on this spectrum, and at one end is the plotters. They plot everything out in advance, often in great detail. So someone like James Elroy will do like 300 or 400 page treatment before he starts writing the narrative. The pantsers, on the other hand, just start writing. They don't know where they're going to go. And I'm much more, it's from writing by the seat of your pants. That's where it comes from. And I'm much more of a pantser, strangely enough, as Karina says, because my books will often have 4 or 5 interwoven plot lines. And that goes back to when I was writing my first book, Scrublands, my first crime fiction book, Scrublands, in my spare time. And one of the things that struck me as I set off to try and write a crime fiction book is one of the big pitfalls is if the reader guesses who done it halfway through the book, because the rest of the book's a complete anticlimax. On the other hand, sometimes you get these books and you can't guess who it is because 10 pages from the end of the book, the author introduces a totally new character and sort of, almost like data dumps all this new information. So once again, though, you feel totally cheated because there's no way you could have known who was going to do it. The best crime books, of course, are the ones where you don't guess, but by the end of the book, it seems really kind of self-evident. You feel like you should have guessed, but you didn't. Anyway, I wasn't sure how to do that. So I went, I know, I'll have more than one plot line. And it's serious, like there's often in the books, there's 4 or 5 plot lines. Some of them are very small, some of them are big. And this one, there's at least 3 different plot lines. I mean, there's like at least 3 different, or probably 4 different crimes, right? So my idea there is a reader might guess one of the plot lines, but they're not going to guess all of them. And I can pretty much guarantee that because when I'm halfway through writing the book, I still haven't guessed what's going to happen. So if I don't know, I can't see how the reader possibly could.
Yeah.
The downside to that, though, of course, is then there's a whole lot of rewriting to do to make sure it all does come together.
And I love the way in Treasure and Dirt how the characters, tell us a little bit more about the 2 main characters, but how the characters also have their own sort of plot of worry, going on plots that are connected to them alone, as well as the big. I'm thinking of the backgrounds of the two main characters and how that suddenly gets brought into the main story.
Yeah, so when I was first mucking around with the idea of running a crime fiction book, and I was writing Scrublands more or less as a kind of a hobby project. I intended to make it as good as I possibly could and try and get it published. But, and I was thinking about characters. And I, as a reader, I really like character-driven narratives. And I thought I didn't want a crime book where the goodies were goodies and the baddies were baddies and never the twain should meet. I wanted it so that good people could do bad things and bad people could do good things. Just like in the start of Treasure and Dirt. The Ratters are obviously bad people, and yet they do the right thing. They alert the police to the fact there's been a murder. And then with the main characters, you get crime fiction books that are self-contained, where there's no outside kind of investigator, no police detective or journalist or whatever. My books do have that sort of outside detective type thing, but I want them involved. And that's what I was saying before. I didn't see how I could take it any further, at least for the moment, with Martin and Mandy. And so these two main characters have got baggage with them. They've got luggage. So Detective Sergeant Ivan Lukic, he's the more experienced. He's the homicide detective from Sydney. He's actually a minor character in the first three books. He's the offsider to the main policeman in them, a guy called Maurice Montefiore. And he's just this minor character. He's quite surly. That's about all you know about him. And here in his book, he's got problems because Maurice Montefiore is under investigation and he's worried that he's going to be sort of incriminated by his association. So he's fighting off these suspicions. Meanwhile, Nell Buchanan, she's come in from Burke, a last-minute kind of replacement. But the reason she's been sent there, they've chosen her, is because she used to be a uniformed police officer in this town, Finnegan's Gap. It was her first job, and she did well there. At least she thinks she did well there. And it's only as she gets back and they start investigating, she discovers she actually didn't do that well, that she kind of stuffed up. And then I'm getting close to giving away spoilers.
Yeah, careful.
But so both of them suddenly find they've got skin in the games. Both of them, for different reasons, realise that their careers are at stake. This could be a game ender for them. And so they're kind of forced together. They're unsure whether they should be supporting each other or throwing one another under a bus, that sort of thing. So that's this whole different dynamic. But it also increases the urgency for them to get a result, to find out who killed this miner and why. Because if they do a good job, they figure it will take some of the pressure off themselves.
I've got a good question from Carolyn. So she says, we get to see Ivan Lukic again. Will we ever get to hear more from Martin in future books? Carolyn thinks she has a wee crush on him.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Carolyn. Yeah, I reckon Martin and Mandy will be back. I've just got to get the right story for them. Martin gets a mention in this book. So there's a little, some of the minor characters from the previous books get a mention. So as I said, Ivan Lukic is actually in those first three books. There's a couple of others who get a, like the particularly thick television reporter Doug Funkleton gets a mention. Martin himself gets a mention. He's kind of like a off-page character, if you like. And I kind of like that. So it's sort of in the same universe, if you like. So that there's potential for characters from previous books to appear in future books. And I know, as a reader, I like that. And just to preempt a question that may or may not come, you're talking about you might have a bit of a crush on Martin. I'm often asked if it's made into a TV series, who will play Martin?
Yeah.
And I've honestly, I've got no idea. So no idea.
Mm. And Belinda's interested to know what you like to read yourself, and I'm wondering if maybe there is something you've been reading lately you could recommend to us.
Oh, okay. My go-to reading, I think before I started writing, was more like contemporary fiction. So I do like occasionally sort of getting out of reading crime fiction, which I'm only reading crime fiction now. The non-crime fiction ones I've read in the last little while that were really good were Mayflies by Andrew O'Hagan, which is he's an English writer. And it's a while ago now, but I thought The Weekend by Charlotte Wood was really good. Of the crime fiction I've been reading lately, let me look around. I really liked Michael Robotham's most recent one. What else have I read lately? I liked Before You Knew My Name by Jacqueline Bublitz.
Yeah.
I like very much The Housemate by Sarah Bailey too. So they're two. If you want crime fiction recommendations, that will be maybe two quick recommendations right there.
Yeah, no, that's some good ones. And we spoke before about Martin Scarsdon. Mary Lou's wondering if there's a bit of you in Martin Scarsdon.
I hope not too much, because he's a bit.
Yeah, what is he, Chris? He's a bit what?
At the start of Scrublands, he's a bit, let's say, emotionally retarded. I mean, he's 40. He's never had a proper relationship. You know, he's a bit of a womanizer, a foreign correspondent type. So, not based on me, that part of him, but based perhaps on some correspondents I met in my travels overseas, particularly conflict journalists and photographers and camera operators. They can get quite post-traumatic and quite traumatized in a sense. So that part of him is not based on me at all. Some of the journalistic practices, it's good to have a journalist, I think, as a protagonist, because you actually have a legitimate reason to be putting your nose in where it's not wanted. You know, you can ring someone up and say, "Hi, I'm from the Sydney Morning Herald" or something, and people, they might not talk to you, but they don't think that you don't have a reason to be calling up or putting your nose in. Whereas if you're just a citizen, it'd just be like, get lost sort of thing. And so some of the journalistic work practices, although it's interesting, I mean, I only stopped working as a journalist in 2017. But even reading Trust, I was ringing up friends to check out, well, what are the deadlines like now? Because the industry just keeps changing so quickly. So, no, I don't think there's a lot of Martin personality comes from me, but maybe some of the work practices,
Yeah.
And what about some of your, you include a bit of social commentary, political commentary in your books too, just sort of a few offhand remarks or opinions that your characters have. Is that something that you just have to include?
No, I think it's something that happens quite often in crime fiction, almost unintentionally. So, and I think it's because writers are trying to pick up on what's worrying people, might concern them, might frighten them. So, for example, 20 years ago, there was a lot of crime books written about serial killers, because serial killers were the big sort of thing in the news. In the thriller space, the baddies were the Russians, and then they weren't. So it was like white South Africans, and that was North Koreans, and then it was Islamic terrorists, and now it's probably, white rights extremists, that sort of thing. In the crime writing space, it's a bit more subtle, but someone like Michael Connolly in America writes about, disadvantage, and one of the point that he makes in his books that even the poor deserve justice. So I think right now there's quite a few books coming out like that like the one I just mentioned, Before You Knew My Name. And it's touching on violence against women. Another really good one like that is The Family Doctor by Deb Oswald. And that's really a story. It's a crime fiction story, but it's really about domestic violence. In Jacqueline Bublitz's book, Before You Knew My Name, her point, I think, was in the past, the detective is the hero. There's a lot of attention paid to the bad guy, the perpetrator, often sections written from their perspective. And the victim, typically a woman, is almost forgotten. It's just like a means to an end. And so I think almost without knowing it, crime writers are kind of touching on issues that are of concern of the population. You know, probably a few years ago when ICE was first a big thing, you know, that would be popping up all the time in crime fiction books. Cybercrime is probably popping up more now. So if I do it, it's not so much a conscious effort. It's not like, oh, I want to express my view on this, or I want to hand out a lecture to someone. It's just, I think it probably just adds a little bit of realism to the stories.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Belinda's wondering about if you have a set writing routine or place that you like to write.
Okay, well, it's changed a bit. So when I was writing Scrublands, I was working a full-time job. So like most aspiring authors, it was writing on, you know, late at night or, you know, stolen hours on the weekend, that sort of thing. I'm really fortunate now I'm a full-time writer. I typically write in the morning, and then in the afternoon, I'll be doing other stuff, exercise or housework or, you know, whatever. As I go along, as the book develops, so much more of that time in the afternoon is spent thinking. It's almost like I'm becoming more and more immersed in my books. And then, even though I'm kind of writing in dribs and drabs, near the end, I'll have a week or two at different times when I just get away by myself and just concentrate on nothing else, trying to bring all those strands of all those different plot lines together, trying to make one of the most difficult things as a writer, particularly, probably in any kind of fiction, is just the pacing of the story. And so you can concentrate on little chapters here and chapters there and get them smooth, but to get the overall shape of the book, I find I need that intense amount of time. I don't do word counts, so I don't sit down and say I have to write 1,000 words before I get up. Some days I write heaps. Some days I get stuck and I'm just staring at the screen. My theory is that those times are just as valuable as the really kind of prolific times because you're working through a problem. The other thing, though, this year that's been different is I really like writing away from home. I think it goes back to my time as a journalist, particularly a travelling journalist. So I write at airports, I write in hotels, I love writing on the train, I write in cafes, whatever. But, you know, with lockdown, we've been in lockdown here in Canberra more seriously this year. Now I've been stuck at my desk, so hopefully next year I'll be back writing on trains and planes and stuff a bit more.
What do you find to be the hardest thing about writing a novel, Chris?
Just bringing it all together, I think. Getting the ideas, having it evolve. Some of it's kind of indirect. It's just when you're suffering some self-doubts, or, you know, is it working? How's it going to go? I always get very nervous once I've finished and signed off, just in the week or two leading up to publication and just after, when it's totally out of my hands, right? So that's why I typically start working on another book just to take my my mind off it. So that's a difficult one, and I'm always a little bit worried about there's some flaw in the logic, something I haven't I haven't picked up on. So that's a concern as well.
And do you have readers, special readers that read your manuscript before you hand it in, or how do you go about that?
No, I did with my with Scrublands. 4 of my really good friends, all of them journalists, but a couple have also written books. Read that and got feedback, and it evolved over a number of years. Now, however, I've been doing a book a year.
Yeah.
Once I get it as good as I possibly can, it then kind of more or less simultaneously will go to my agent, Grace Heifetz, and my publisher, Jane Palfreyman, and I'll give immediate feedback, and then it goes into this editing process. And I work with possibly the best team of editors in Australia. Well, I think they are. There's Jane, and there's Krista Munns and Ali Laveau and Kate Goldsworthy. And they edit the books of all these, like, Christoph Solkos and Sophie Laguna and Michelle de Kretzer and Charlotte Wood and, all these really, really eminent literary writers. The fact that they're sort of helping me is unbelievable. But given I'm working with them, I probably don't need more the casual reader. I don't know if I got the time. And then it will also at some point go off to the UK and wherever for feedback as well.
And we've got a few people who are wondering what you're working on at the moment, if you can share anything about that.
Yeah, so as I said, I like to start working on the next book. Just almost get my mind off every worries about how this one is going. But there's also a practical reason for that, in that this book is published in October, but I've really polished it as much as I possibly can to give to the publisher in February. Yeah. And then there's the backwards and forwards of the different editing. But even so, I've probably signed off on the last edits by the end of July at the latest. So then there's a couple of months there where I can't really do anything more for the book and before things like publicity start. So it's a really good opportunity not only to get my mind into a different place, but to actually get out and start writing. So I am writing another book, and it's almost certainly going to be another Ivan and Nell book. So even though we're saying that Treasure and Dirt is a standalone book, it is at the moment, but I think that there will be a follow-up. Yeah, maybe that's all I should give away at the moment.
Yeah. And I'm interested, like, you have the characters, it sounds like, interweaving in your books, even though they are standalone. Is that because you can't let go of your characters?
No, it's because I start finding them really interesting.
Yeah.
So what happened with Scrublands? I was just thinking it was a standalone book. But in writing it, I almost surprised myself, because I was thinking what defines a good crime book is plot. I now don't think it is. I think plot's really important, but I think characters are possibly more important.
Yeah.
And then there's things like setting and how you write and a whole bunch of other stuff. And one of the things I learned in writing Scrublands is I liked how how Martin changed over the course of the book, so that the Martin Scarsden at the end of the book was different than the guy at the start. He was starting to become more self-aware. He was starting, for the first time in his life, to commit to a relationship. And I found him an interesting guy, and I wanted to learn more about him. And I also wanted to learn more about Mandy Blonde. And so the second book, Silver, we go back to Martin's old hometown. In Scrublands, he's a total outsider. He goes to this town, River Sandy. He's never been there before. He doesn't know anyone. In Silver, he goes back. It's his old hometown. He's still got relatives living there. And he's forced to confront and find out more about the traumatic events of his childhood.
Mm.
And then having done that, I thought, but Mandy is becoming more and more intriguing.
Mm.
So Trust is really about what happened to her in her 20s, and it's all about their relationship. And it's structurally it's different because instead of just having Martin's point of view, the chapters alternate between her point of view and his point of view.
Mm.
So that's how what started as one book became three. And now something similar, I think, is happening with Ivan and Nell.
Yeah.
As I said before, they're not just hands-off investigators. They really have skin in the game in Treasure and Dirt. And once again, as I'm thinking about their backstories, what's motivating them to do things, they're kind of growing in my own mind.
Yeah. And Lorraine, talking about characters, Lorraine's got a good question. She wonders how you come up with such fabulous and slightly outlandish character names.
Yeah. So how this happened more or less by accident. So here I am late at night, exhausted no doubt after a long day at work, writing Scrublands, getting a bit bored. So I started using these kind of more outlandish Dickensian type names, fully expecting Scrublands might get published, but, disappear within a few weeks and I go back to my real job. And lo and behold, Scrublands becomes really successful. And I was feeling a bit sheepish about these names until at an event, a woman came up and said how she liked the distinctive names, she called them. And she said, you've got so many different plot lines. It really helps having the distinctive names because it helps me remember who's who. And I thought, you know what? I think she's right. And of course, having started with these outlandish names and then having Silver and Trust involve some of the same characters, it wasn't as if I could have all the new characters have these really bland, vanilla Tom, Dick, Harry names, but the continuing characters just have these really eccentric, sort of a bit over the top names. So I thought, no, I'm going to lean into this. And it's the same in Treasure and Dirt. There's a bloke called Trevor Topsoil who runs a mining sort of equipment supply place, and there's a lawyer called Cyril Flange, and there's bullshit Bob Inglis who's one of these mining billionaires. So it was an accident that I started using those sort of distinctive names, but I kind of like it, and I do think it helps readers keep track of the plots.
And Lorraine wonders if it's harder to write a sequel or a standalone or start a new series.
Oh, that's a good question. I think in some ways a sequel is easier if you've got your main characters and as in my case, you feel there's unfinished business. But I think if you try and force it too much, it might be harder. So that's why I didn't do another book with Martin and Mandy, because I felt, one, it'd be forced and it wouldn't work, or two, if I wrote them as kind of just investigators, hands-off, disinterested, I thought that might cheat the readers a bit, because they were used to getting involved and seeing inside their heads and seeing what was troubling them and all the rest of it. But I think maybe writing a sequel is a little bit easier because you've already got the characters started.
Yeah. And following on from that question, just wondering, when you're writing a series or sequels, how do you keep things fresh for both yourself and the readers?
Look, I try and do new things with the books. So, I mean, you don't want to alienate the people who've liked the previous books, but all my books have that complex structure as far as plot goes. But the actual structure itself has evolved quite a bit. So in the first book, you just had Martin and everything from his point of view, and it's completely chronological. You have a prologue. It pre-shoots 5 people dead. then the story proper starts. Martin arrives in the town to write a story about how the town is coping a year on. And it's completely chronological. Starts when he arrives in the town, he goes through, investigates, he finds out all these things, and it finishes with him in the town. Silver is pretty much the same, except there's a lot of flashbacks. Trust is different again, and there's 2 points of view, quite formally done. One chapter with Martin, one chapter with Mandy. Treasure and Dirt, a little bit subtly different. 2 points of view, Ivan and Nell, but much more fluid in the way that they change. This next book I'm working on, don't hold me to it, but at this stage it's 3 points of view and 3 totally different timelines. So not completely chronological. So that's one way I'm trying to keep it fresh. I mean, I think it's a trap to try and write the same book twice, to go, oh, that's a bestseller. Oh, I found my formula. And then try and stick to that formula, because it'll become stale. And I think readers will go, oh, it's just another Chris Hammer book. Yeah, it's all right. But,
do you think, though, on the other hand as well, if you tried to change it too much, then
absolutely.
So
absolutely.
It's trying to find the meat.
If I can't have a book, say, with Martin and Mandy in it, and then have aliens land halfway through, right, and turn it into a sci-fi book, or turn it into a horror book, or something like that. So you've got to respect your readers. The readers know the characters, they've imagined them, they've come to life in their mind, they understand the world that they're operating in. So yeah, you have to work within those kind of parameters. If you start a new book or a standalone book, you can change it. There are some writers who alternate between genres, and if it's extreme enough, they'll use different names for the different books they're writing. So J.K. Rowling is Robert Galbraith when she writes crime books. There may be other reasons why she did that, but that's not uncommon too. So if I wanted to write a science fiction book or a fantasy book, I think I'd have to use a different name or a variation on my name, because the last thing you'd want to do is alienate readers who've paid you the very high compliment of reading your books and liking your books.
And I've got a good question from Sylvia. She's wondering if you lie awake at night thinking about what you might write about the next day, or have you got it all sorted?
Oh, well, I definitely don't have it all sorted. Sometimes, I don't know if I lay awake worrying, but sometimes things will come to me in the middle of the night, or I'll wake up in the morning with an idea. I often get my best ideas not when I'm sitting working, but when I'm out walking. I try and do a bit of exercise every day, but typically it's walking, riding a bike, swimming laps, all of which are solitary pursuits. And sometimes, as I'm swimming, I'll get a really good idea, because as the book proceeds, it starts taking over a bit, so that it's always with me and I'm always kind of thinking. Good question, though.
That is a good question. And I've got another really good question as well from MJ. She wonders if you find it difficult writing from a female point of view, and is there a different way you sort of approach writing from a different gender point of view?
It's funny that male authors get asked that in a way that female authors don't. I think there's a couple of things. When you're writing a character, you're not trying to write an every man or an every woman. So the last thing you want to do is try and write a female character that is somehow meant to represent all women. That would be a mistake. And I think, the motivations of people are pretty similar. And there's a huge overlap. So there's some aspects that will differ between male and female, but I don't take a particularly different line on it. It's an interesting question, but in my mind, they become more alive as just individual people. And yeah, I'm sure their gender is kind of part of that sort of overall image that's forming, but it's not something that I want to dwell on too much.
And could you tell us a little bit about how you decided you wanted to write a book? Like you're a journalist. Is that something that you'd always wanted to do?
Look, I think so. Without knowing it, I did write a book. I guess I was in my 20s, just a fiction book, just terrible, in the bottom drawer. Will never see the light of day. Quite a common story, actually. A lot of successful authors, you'll find that they have at least one unpublished manuscript, and they're often pretty ordinary. But I didn't really get a chance. I'd written these non-fiction books, and they were well received. And what I learned from them is that I could do it. Until you write a book, you're really unsure. It seems like, climbing Mount Everest to write a book, right? So that taught me I could do it. The other thing it taught me, which was interesting, is I actually enjoyed writing a book. I think I had that idea, which a lot of people do, is, wouldn't it be great to be a writer? Or wouldn't it be great to have one of your books on the bookshelf sort of thing? But the actual process of writing isn't that enjoyable. In fact, it can be quite daunting. Well, I sort of found out that actually I did like writing. The other thing I learned, though, was there's not a lot of money writing books in Australia. And so I had to go back and get a real job again. And then, so in some sense, I'm kind of like an accidental author in that I didn't expect Scrublands to do so well. So that's one way of looking at it. I guess the other way of looking at it is I persisted because I liked it. And in the end, it sort of, I enjoyed some success. So, but and I was always writing as a journalist too. So, yeah, I suspect more than I realised at the time, I always did want to become a writer.
And Karina, did you have any more questions before?
I was just wondering, have we got time for Chris to read a little bit? I love that. Have you got? I'm springing this on you, Chris. But that prologue, I mean, it's not going to spoil anything, and the prologue really is such a beautiful scene setter for the rest of the story. But only if we've got time, Jackie. I've lost track of the time.
It's only 7 or 8 pages, but it'll actually take quite a bit of time to read, I think. So maybe not.
I just meant a little taster of it.
Oh, all right. Let's see. This is the ratters on their way to go down this mine. Next, excuse me. Next to the driver, the leader is experiencing a kind of calm, settled now that the operation is underway, the sort of tranquility that used to visit him before combat. The preceding few hours are worse, hiding underground on his own barren claim, waiting for the Opal fields to empty, fellow ratters nervous and edgy, unable to sleep, unable to speak, forbidden by him from drinking or taking drugs. 4 men, trapped together, bound by circumstance. 200 metres from the mine shaft, the truck stops. The driver cuts the engine, pivoting on the point of no return. And the leader climbs out. It's his operation. He's the one who must take the risks. They've been watching the mine for a week or so, on and off, through the rain, through the mounting heat, more diligently these past 2 nights. There has been no sighting of Jonas McGee, not today, not yesterday. The intel must be right. He's out of town, living it up on his windfall, squandering his fortune, hundreds of thousands of dollars, according to the rumour mill, maybe even millions. But gone for now, careless in his wealth, stupid in his luck, almost deserving of looting. Almost. Yeah,
It's so atmospheric. It's just amazing. Yeah, love it.
Oh, thank you, Karina.
Well, thanks so much for joining us. Thanks to Alan and Unwin for organising the interview and giving away some of your Treasure and Dirt copies. As I said at the beginning, some people might not have heard that Treasure and Dirt was the first of your books that I've read and really enjoyed it. So telling everyone to go out and get a copy of Treasure and Dirt. And thanks, Karina, for joining me as well. So thanks everyone who joined in. We had some really great questions. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much.
Bye, Chris.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.